On the morning of December 16th, 1944, Oberleutnant Karl Brommann stood in the commander's cupola of his Panther tank, watching the fog roll through the Ardennes forest near the Belgian-German border. Brommann was 23 years old. He had been fighting for 3 years. He commanded the 2nd platoon of the 2nd Company, 2nd Panzer Division, and at that moment he was about to participate in Germany's last major offensive in the west. His tank had enough fuel to travel approximately 30 miles under combat conditions, maybe 40 if they were lucky and didn't encounter heavy resistance. The distance to his objective, the Meuse River, was 75 miles. Brommann had asked his company commander about this discrepancy 3 days earlier during the final planning briefing. The answer had been clear and direct. They would capture American fuel along the way. There was no alternative. The Reich simply did not have enough fuel to sustain the offensive all the way to Antwerp. The plan required German forces to seize enemy supply dumps during their advance. Brommann understood what this meant. His survival, his mission's success, everything depended on capturing supplies from an enemy that had so far shown no inclination to leave supplies behind for the taking. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Ardennes offensive, later known to Americans as the Battle of the Bulge, was Adolf Hitler's last gamble in the West. 3 German armies, 28 divisions, over 400,000 men, supported by nearly 1,500 tanks and assault guns. The goal was audacious: punch through weak American lines in the Ardennes, cross the Meuse River, drive northwest to Antwerp, split the Allied armies, capture the vital port that was feeding the Allied advance, and force a negotiated peace in the West. Then, Germany could concentrate all remaining strength against the Soviets in the East. The operation required fuel, enormous quantities of fuel. Hitler had promised 28 million liters would be allocated for the offensive. But by December 15th, only 14 million liters had actually been assembled at forward depots. Enough, German planners calculated, for maybe a third to half the distance to Antwerp under ideal conditions. Combat conditions were never ideal. Tanks consumed fuel at staggering rates when maneuvering under fire, climbing hills, crossing rough terrain. Every hour of idling while waiting for infantry support burned precious liters. Every detour around an obstacle or destroyed bridge added miles and consumed fuel that couldn't be replaced. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, overall commander of German forces in the West, understood the mathematics. His staff officers understood the mathematics. Many division and regiment commanders understood the mathematics. They had all raised concerns during planning meetings throughout November. The fuel allocation was insufficient. The operation could not reach its objectives with available resources. The counter-argument from Hitler's headquarters was simple. German forces would capture what they needed. American supply dumps were known to exist all across Belgium. Intelligence had identified specific locations. The Americans, Hitler's staff argued, were notoriously wasteful with supplies. They left material everywhere. German troops would simply take what they needed from defeated American units. This assumption rested on several beliefs about American forces. First, that American soldiers lacked fighting spirit and would abandon their positions and supplies when attacked with sufficient aggression. Second, that American logistics were so abundant that supply dumps would be found everywhere, unguarded and ripe for capture. Third, that American commanders would not have time to destroy supplies before retreating. These beliefs were about to collide with reality in the most brutal way possible. Brommann's 2nd Panzer Division was one of the best equipped formations in the German military by late 1944. It fielded Panthers, the best medium tank Germany produced. It had experienced crews, it had veteran infantry, it had artillery support. What it did not have was enough fuel. The division's fuel reserves on December the 16th totaled approximately 6 days of supply at normal operational rates. Under combat conditions, moving cross-country, engaging enemy forces, that 6 days would shrink to perhaps 3 or 4. The route assigned to 2nd Panzer Division ran through Clairvaux, then northwest toward Bastogne. then west toward the Meuse. Brommann studied his maps during the pre-attack hours. He calculated distances. He estimated fuel consumption. He tried to identify where American supply dumps might be located along his route. The intelligence briefings had been vague. American supplies existed. German forces would find them. That was the extent of the guidance. At 5:30 on the morning of December 16th, German artillery opened fire along an 80-mile front. Brommann's tank shook from the concussion of nearby batteries. He could see the flashes lighting the pre-dawn darkness. For 90 minutes, over 1,800 artillery pieces and multiple rocket launcher batteries pounded American positions. Then the tank started moving. The initial advance went well. American forces in the Ardennes were thinly spread, 4 divisions covering 80 miles. Some units were green, newly arrived in theatre. Others were worn down, resting after heavy fighting further north. The German assault achieved surprise and local superiority. By midday, on December 16th, a 2nd Panzer Division had penetrated several miles into American-held territory. Brommann's platoon destroyed 2 American tanks, both Shermans, near a crossroads east of Clairvaux. His own tank consumed fuel steadily. The rough terrain and constant maneuvering burned through liters faster than highway driving would have. By evening of the first day, Brommann estimated his tank had used approximately 1/3 of its fuel load. They had advanced perhaps 12 miles. The mathematics were not encouraging. But the offensive continued. December 17th brought harder fighting. American forces, recovering from initial shock, began establishing defensive positions. Pockets of resistance slowed the advance. Every delay cost fuel. Tanks idled while waiting for infantry to clear strongpoints. They maneuvered around obstacles. They reversed course when routes proved blocked. On December 18th, Brommann's company commander called a meeting of platoon leaders. The fuel situation was becoming critical. Division headquarters had promised resupply would arrive that evening. Meanwhile, all units were ordered to continue advancing, to maintain momentum, to reach the Meuse before American reinforcements could arrive. The promised resupply did not arrive on December 18th, or December 19th, or December 20th. What did arrive was word from reconnaissance units. They had located an American fuel depot at Stavelot, approximately 15 miles north of 2nd Panzer's current position. The depot reportedly contained millions of gallons of gasoline. Kampfgruppe Piper, a spearhead unit from 1st SS Panzer Division, was approaching the depot from the east. If Piper could capture it intact, fuel would be distributed to other formations. Brommann never saw that fuel. On December 19th, American engineers destroyed the Stavelot depot, 3 million gallons of gasoline, before Piper's tanks could reach it. The Americans had been thorough. They set demolition charges. They ignited fuel with white phosphorus grenades. They made certain nothing useful remained for German forces. The same pattern repeated across the Ardennes. Wherever German spearheads approached American supply points, the Americans destroyed what they couldn't evacuate. Fuel dumps were ignited, ammunition was blown up, food stores were burned. Nothing was left behind. This was not panic or disorganization. This was American doctrine, executed under pressure with remarkable efficiency. Every major supply depot had pre-planned demolition procedures. Engineers knew which installations to destroy first. Quartermaster officers knew how to evacuate what could be saved and destroy what couldn't. The process was systematic and ruthless. German intelligence had been wrong about American logistics on a fundamental level. American supplies were not carelessly scattered across the countryside in undefended dumps waiting to be captured. American logistics were centralized, controlled, and defended. More importantly, American commanders understood that supply denial was as important as supply delivery. What the enemy couldn't take couldn't be used against you. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. By December 20th, Brommann's tank was running on fumes. His entire platoon was in the same condition. They had traveled approximately 40 miles from their start line. They were 35 miles short of the Meuse River. Their fuel tanks showed barely enough to travel another 10 miles, maybe 15 if they were lucky. Division headquarters sent increasingly desperate messages. Keep moving. Fuel was coming. Hold your positions. Prepare to advance. The messages contradicted each other because the reality contradicted them. On December 21st, Brommann's company received a fuel delivery, not the full resupply they needed. A partial delivery, enough to give each tank perhaps 20 additional miles of range. The fuel came in jerry cans, carried forward by trucks that were themselves nearly out of fuel. The delivery included a message from division supply officers. This was all that was available. Make it last. More would come when possible. Brommann poured the fuel into his tank's reservoir and watched the gauge rise slightly. He calculated that with careful driving, minimal maneuvering, and good luck, he might reach within 10 miles of the Meuse. Then what? The answer was obvious. Then nothing. His tank would sit immobile, a 45-ton steel monument to the failure of German logistics. Meanwhile, on the other side of the battlefield, American logistics were performing miracles of a different kind. When the German offensive began on December 16th, American supply lines were focused on supporting the advance into Germany further north and south. Massive supply depots existed at Liège in Belgium, at various points in France, all feeding American armies that had been attacking eastward since June. The Ardennes offensive threatened to cut those supply lines and capture those depots. American response was immediate and overwhelming. Within 48 hours of the German attack, American commanders had begun reorienting their entire logistics network. Supplies that had been moving east toward the German border were redirected south toward the Ardennes. Truck convoys were rerouted. Rail shipments were diverted. Air transport was committed to critical deliveries. The flexibility was stunning. Supply operations that had been planned weeks in advance were torn up and rewritten in hours. General George Patton's Third Army, fighting south of the Ardennes, received orders on December the 19th to disengage, pivot 90 degrees north, and counterattack into the southern shoulder of the German penetration. This required moving 3 divisions over 130,000 men, plus all their equipment, ammunition, fuel, and supplies, 70 miles over winter roads in 48 hours. It also required ensuring those divisions would be supplied once they reached the battle area. American logistics made it happen. On December the 22nd, Patton's forces attacked north. They were fully supplied. Their fuel tanks were full. Their ammunition trucks were loaded. Their field kitchens were operational. American soldiers going into battle against German forces were eating hot meals from mobile kitchens that had traveled 70 miles in 2 days and set up to serve breakfast before the attack. Brommann, sitting in his fuel-starved tank 30 miles short of his objective, had no knowledge of Patton's redeployment. He did not know about American supply convoys running day and night to sustain forces rushing to contain the German penetration. He did not know that while his own supply system was collapsing under the strain of a single offensive, American supply systems were supporting multiple armies simultaneously across hundreds of miles. What Brommann did know was that his tank wasn't moving. Neither were most of the tanks in his company, or his battalion, or his division. 2nd Panzer Division, having pushed farther west than any other German formation, reaching within 4 miles of the Meuse River at Dinant, was now effectively immobilized. Not because American forces had destroyed them in battle, because they had run out of fuel. On December the 24th, Brommann received orders to prepare for withdrawal. The offensive had failed to reach Antwerp. It had failed to cross the Meuse. It had failed to split the Allied armies. Now, with American counterattacks pushing from north and south, German forces had to pull back before being encircled. Withdrawal required fuel. Every tank had to move back to German lines. Moving required fuel that didn't exist. Division supply officers performed triage. Some vehicles would be fueled for withdrawal, others would be destroyed in its place to prevent capture. Brommann's tank made the cut. He received enough fuel to travel approximately 30 miles, enough to reach German lines if nothing went wrong. Other tanks in his company were not so fortunate. He watched crews set demolition charges on perfectly functional Panthers that simply had empty fuel tanks. Good machines, good weapons, rendered useless by an empty fuel gauge. The retreat was chaotic. American aircraft, taking advantage of clearing weather, attacked anything that moved. American artillery pounded German columns. American tanks pushed from multiple directions, and through it all, German forces tried to move faster than their logistics could support. Some units made it back, others were cut off and forced to surrender. Equipment losses were catastrophic. By early January 1945, the Battle of the Bulge was over. Germany had committed its last reserves, lost hundreds of thousands of casualties, destroyed hundreds of tanks and thousands of vehicles, and achieved nothing permanent. The Allies had been surprised, pushed back, temporarily disrupted. Then American logistics had responded, reoriented, and sustained a counter-offensive that crushed the German penetration. Brommann survived. His tank made it back to German lines. He fought for 4 more months through retreats across Germany until his unit surrendered to American forces in April 1945. After the war, he spoke to military historians about the Ardennes offensive. When asked what he remembered most, he did not talk about combat. He talked about fuel, about watching supply trucks arrive empty because there was no fuel to put in them, about receiving orders to advance when his tanks couldn't move, about realizing that no amount of courage or tactical skill could overcome the simple fact that his tank needed fuel and Germany couldn't provide it. He said the moment he truly understood Germany had lost the war was not when he saw American tanks or aircraft. It was when he calculated fuel consumption against fuel availability and realized the mathematics made victory impossible. An army cannot advance without fuel. It cannot fight without fuel. It cannot even retreat without fuel. And Germany, by December 1944, did not have enough fuel to do any of those things adequately. The fuel crisis that crippled 2nd Panzer Division was not an isolated incident. It was the culmination of strategic decisions and resource constraints that had plagued German military operations since the beginning of the war. Understanding why Brommann's tank sat immobile 4 miles from the Meuse requires understanding how Germany had structured its entire war economy around a resource it did not possess in sufficient quantities. Germany's oil situation in 1944 was catastrophic. The Reich consumed approximately 7.8 million tons of oil products annually to sustain military operations. Domestic production from synthetic fuel plants, which converted coal into gasoline through the Fischer-Tropsch process, provided roughly 4 million tons per year. The remaining 3.8 million tons had to come from imports and captured sources. Romanian oil fields at Ploiești had been a major source until August 1944, when Soviet forces captured them. Hungarian oil fields provided some supply, but nowhere near enough to replace Ploiești's loss. By late 1944, Allied strategic bombing had devastated German synthetic fuel production. American bombers targeted hydrogenation plants systematically. Raids in May and June 1944 reduced synthetic fuel output by 67%. Production recovered partially through desperate repair efforts, only to be hammered again in subsequent raids. German fuel production in September 1944 was 9,200 tons of aviation gasoline per day. By March 1945, it had dropped to 1,000 tons per day. The numbers meant that by December 1944, when Hitler launched the Ardennes offensive, Germany was operating on fuel reserves that were rapidly depleting with no prospect of replenishment. Every litre allocated to the offensive was a litre that could not be used for defensive operations on other fronts. Every tank that burned fuel in the Ardennes was fuel not available for training new crews, for defending against the next Soviet offensive in the east, for anything else. American fuel production, by contrast, was effectively unlimited. The United States produced over 220 million barrels of oil in 1944, approximately 31 million tons. That figure represented roughly 60% of total world oil production. American industry converted crude oil into gasoline, diesel, aviation fuel, lubricants, everything a modern military needed at rates that exceeded all Axis powers, combined by factors of 10 or more. American forces in Europe consumed approximately 1 million gallons of fuel per day in late 1944. That's approximately 3,800 tons daily. American logistics delivered it every day, without interruption, to armies spread across France, Belgium, and approaching the German border. The fuel came from refineries in Texas, Louisiana, and California. It was loaded onto tanker ships on the Gulf Coast and West Coast. It crossed the Atlantic, sometimes in convoys, sometimes in fast independent ships. It was unloaded at ports in France and Belgium. It was stored in massive tank farms. It was distributed to forward depots by truck, by rail, by pipeline. Then it was delivered to combat units by dedicated fuel trucks that made continuous runs from depots to frontline positions. This system worked because it was built to work. American military logistics treated fuel as the lifeblood of mechanized warfare. Entire organizational structures existed solely to manage fuel flow. The Quartermaster Corps operated pipeline battalions, truck companies, tanker ship operations, storage facilities, quality control laboratories. Thousands of personnel did nothing but move fuel from point of production to point of consumption. German logistics had no equivalent system. Germany had supply officers, transport units, fuel dumps, but the infrastructure was improvised, adapted from peacetime systems never designed to support global mechanized warfare. German fuel distribution relied heavily on railroads, which were increasingly disrupted by Allied air attacks. When rail lines were cut, supplies had to move by truck. But Germany did not have enough trucks, and the trucks they had consumed fuel that was in short supply. The contrast extended beyond simple production numbers. American fuel was high quality, refined to precise specifications, tested for consistency. German fuel, especially by late war, was whatever could be produced. Synthetic fuel from coal had lower octane ratings than petroleum-based fuel. Quality varied between batches. Impurities sometimes damaged engines. German tank crews learned to be cautious with fuel from unfamiliar sources because bad fuel could disable a tank more effectively than enemy fire. American tankers had no such concerns. Every jerrycan of fuel, every barrel, every tanker truckload met strict quality standards. Fuel was fuel. It worked. It didn't damage engines. Crews could focus on fighting, not on worrying whether their fuel would destroy their own vehicle. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The logistical differences were visible in how the two armies approached basic operations. When an American armored division planned an attack, fuel was assumed to be available. The question was not whether fuel would arrive, but how much operational range would be needed and where refueling would occur. American planning documents from late 1944 show assumptions of fuel availability that German planners would have considered fantasy. An American armored division in 1944 contained approximately 390 tanks and other armored vehicles, plus 2,500 wheeled vehicles. Total fuel capacity in vehicle tanks was roughly 65,000 gallons. A full day of combat operations could consume 50,000 to 70,000 gallons, depending on intensity and terrain. American logistics planned for 3 days of supply to be available at division level, with additional reserves at corps and army level. That meant an armored division was backed by roughly 200,000 gallons of readily accessible fuel, with more available from higher echelons if needed. German armored divisions in 1944 had no such luxury. A Panzer Division might have fuel for 3 to 5 days of operations if fully supplied, which was increasingly rare. Reserve stocks beyond immediate division holdings were limited and often located far from the front due to Allied air superiority, making forward storage dangerous. German divisions learned to hoard fuel, to jealously guard every liter, to operate with the constant knowledge that resupply was uncertain. This difference shaped tactical decisions at every level. American commanders could authorize aggressive maneuvers, knowing their logistics could support rapid advances. German commanders had to factor fuel availability into every decision. An opportunity to exploit a breakthrough might exist, but if fuel wasn't available, the opportunity had to be passed up. The Ardennes offensive exemplified this constraint. German operational planning called for rapid advances to reach objectives before American reinforcements arrived. Speed was essential, but speed consumed fuel. German tanks had to move fast enough to maintain momentum, but not so fast they exhausted fuel before reaching objectives. The contradiction was irresolvable with available resources. Kampfgruppe Peiper, the spearhead formation that came closest to Stavelot and its 3 million gallons of American fuel, demonstrated the problem perfectly. Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper commanded approximately 5,000 men with tanks, half-tracks, and support vehicles. His mission was to drive northwest as fast as possible, cross the Meuse River bridges before American forces could destroy them, and establish a bridgehead for follow-on forces. Peiper started the offensive with fuel for approximately 60 miles under ideal conditions. His route to the Meuse was over 70 miles. His orders explicitly stated he was to capture American fuel along the way. Peiper later testified that he knew before starting that he lacked sufficient fuel to reach his objective. He proceeded anyway, because orders were orders, and because he hoped American fuel would be available. On December 17th, Peiper's column captured the town of Stavelot after heavy fighting. American engineers had already prepared the fuel depot for demolition. As Peiper's tanks approached, the engineers triggered their charges. 3 million gallons of gasoline erupted in flames, visible for miles. Peiper's forces came within 1,000 feet of the depot, close enough to feel the heat from the fire. Not close enough to capture a single usable drop. The loss was catastrophic. Peiper's fuel situation, already critical, became desperate. He pushed forward, hoping to find other supplies. On December 18th, he captured an American supply dump near Trois Ponts. The dump contained food, ammunition, medical supplies, clothing. No fuel. On December 19th, near Stoumont, his column overran another American position. Again, no significant fuel stocks. By December 20th, Peiper's Kampfgruppe was effectively immobilized. His tanks had reached the village of La Glaise, approximately 40 miles from their start line and 35 miles short of the Meuse. They could not advance. They did not have fuel to withdraw. American forces surrounded the position. For 4 days, Peiper's men fought off attacks, hoping German relief columns would break through with fuel. The relief never came. On December 23rd, Peiper ordered his men to destroy all vehicles and heavy weapons and attempt to escape on foot through American lines. They abandoned over 70 tanks and assault guns plus all trucks and equipment. The vehicles were mechanically functional. They simply had no fuel. Peiper and approximately 800 of his 5,000 men successfully escaped. The rest were killed or captured. The entire Kampfgruppe, Germany's best-equipped spearhead formation, led by one of its most experienced officers, had been destroyed not by American firepower, but by lack of fuel. American intelligence officers examining the abandoned vehicles at La Glaise found most had empty or nearly empty fuel tanks. Many showed evidence of having been pushed or towed into defensive positions because they lacked fuel to drive there. The same pattern repeated across the Ardennes battlefield. German units advanced until fuel exhausted, then stopped. 5th Panzer Army in the center of the offensive made significant penetration, but ran out of fuel before reaching critical objectives. 6th Panzer Army in the north, despite including the most powerful German formations, was largely stopped by fuel shortages, combined with American resistance. Meanwhile, American logistics were solving problems German logistics couldn't even attempt. When Bastogne was encircled on December 20th, cutting off road access, American commanders needed to supply the garrison by air. Within 24 hours, C-47 transport aircraft were dropping supplies by parachute. Over the next week, aircraft delivered over 950 tons of ammunition, fuel, medical supplies, and food to Bastogne's defenders. The operation required coordination between multiple commands, rapid assembly of supplies at airfields, precise navigation to drop zones, and willingness to accept aircraft losses to anti-aircraft fire. American logistics executed it as a matter of course. German forces besieging Bastogne watched American aircraft overhead and knew they had no equivalent capability. The Luftwaffe could not have sustained such an operation even if fuel had been available. The organizational infrastructure simply did not exist. On December the 26th, elements of Patton's Third Army broke through to Bastogne, relieving the siege. The relief column brought with it trucks loaded with fuel, ammunition, and supplies. Bastogne's garrison, after being surrounded for 6 days, was resupplied to full strength within 48 hours of the siege being lifted. They were ready to resume offensive operations immediately. No German formation in similar circumstances could have expected similar support. If a German unit was surrounded and cut off, it fought with what it had until ammunition and fuel were exhausted, then surrendered. There was no expectation of relief, no certainty of resupply, no organizational structure capable of delivering resources to isolated formations on short notice. The Battle of the Bulge officially ended in late January 1945. German forces had been pushed back to their start lines. The bulge in Allied lines had been eliminated. Casualties on both sides were heavy. American forces suffered approximately 80,000 casualties, including 19,000 killed. German forces suffered over 100,000 casualties, including somewhere between 12,000 and 16,000 killed, with estimates varying by source. But the material losses told the real story. Germany lost over 700 tanks and assault guns during the offensive. Many were destroyed in combat. Many more were abandoned due to lack of fuel or mechanical breakdown, with no means to recover or repair them. Germany lost over 1,000 aircraft, mostly to American air superiority. Once weather cleared, Germany expended fuel reserves that could not be replaced, ammunition stocks that took months to rebuild, and combat strength that no longer existed in reserve. American material losses were also significant. Over 730 tanks were lost or damaged. Hundreds of trucks and other vehicles were destroyed. But American losses could be replaced. Factories in Detroit were producing tanks. Refineries in Texas were producing fuel. The logistical pipeline would deliver replacements within weeks. For Germany, there were no replacements. What was lost in the Ardennes was lost permanently. The offensive had been Germany's last throw of the dice. Hitler had gambled that a surprise attack in winter, through terrain Americans considered impassable for armor, could achieve strategic success before American material superiority became overwhelming. The gamble failed because German logistics could not support the operational plan. The courage of German soldiers, the quality of German equipment, the tactical skill of German commanders, none of it mattered when tanks sat immobilized for lack of fuel 4 miles short of their objectives. After the war, American and British intelligence officers interrogated hundreds of German officers about the Ardennes offensive. A consistent theme emerged from these interrogations. German officers at all levels, from company commanders to field marshals, acknowledged that the fuel situation had been recognized as critical during planning, but that objections had been overruled. Hitler had insisted the offensive would succeed. His staff had planned accordingly, building assumptions of captured American supplies into operational orders because those assumptions were necessary to make the plan work mathematically. General Hasso von Manteuffel, commanding 5th Panzer Army during the offensive, later stated that he had calculated before the attack that available fuel was insufficient for his forces to reach the Meuse. He had reported this to higher headquarters. He had been told that fuel would be captured from American dumps. When asked after the war whether he believed that guidance, von Manteuffel replied that belief was irrelevant. Orders were orders. He executed the operation knowing it would fail for logistical reasons. This was not isolated incompetence or delusional thinking by a single commander. This was systematic failure at the highest strategic level. Germany in late 1944 was planning operations it could not logistically sustain, gambling on capturing resources from an enemy that had demonstrated consistent ability to deny those resources, and sending soldiers into battle knowing the plan was based on assumptions unlikely to materialize. The fundamental difference between American and German logistics was not merely a matter of production capacity, though that gap was enormous. It was a difference in strategic philosophy, in how each nation understood modern warfare and what was required to sustain it. This philosophical difference had roots that extended back decades before the first shots of World War II were fired. The United States had entered World War I in 1917 with a small army and virtually no experience in modern mechanized warfare. What America did have was industrial capacity beyond anything Europe had seen. Factories that produced automobiles, locomotives, agricultural machinery could be converted to military production. American military planners in the 1920s and 30s studied the Great War's lessons and reached a conclusion that would shape all future operations. Modern warfare was industrial warfare. Victory would go to the nation that could outproduce and outsupply its enemies. This conclusion drove American military development between the wars. When the Army began mechanizing in the 1930s, the emphasis was not merely on acquiring tanks and trucks, but on building the infrastructure to sustain mechanized forces in combat. Doctrine was written around assumptions of mechanical transport. Training programs taught logistics alongside tactics. Officer education emphasized supply chain management as much as battlefield maneuver. Germany's interwar development followed a different path. Constrained by Versailles Treaty limitations, German military planners focused on quality over quantity, on tactical excellence over material abundance. The Panzer Divisions that revolutionized warfare in 1939 and 1940 were built around concepts of speed, shock, and maneuver. They were magnificent instruments of offensive warfare, but they were not designed for sustained operations across vast distances. They were designed for short, decisive campaigns like Poland and France, where German logistics could support rapid advances to nearby objectives. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, this limitation became immediately apparent. Operation Barbarossa was planned as a 3 to 4 month campaign. German logistics were structured accordingly: light, mobile, sufficient for a short war. When the Red Army did not collapse and the campaign extended into winter, German logistics collapsed instead. The infrastructure simply did not exist to sustain millions of men fighting across thousands of miles of primitive Russian territory. Germany attempted to adapt, captured Soviet trucks, supplemented German transport. Horses, millions of horses, were pressed into service to haul supplies where trucks could not operate. Railroads were converted from Soviet gauge to German gauge, a monumental engineering effort that absorbed resources desperately needed elsewhere. But adaptations and improvisations could not substitute for systematic logistics infrastructure that had never been built. The United States, entering the war in December 1941, brought to bear the logistical philosophy it had developed over 20 years. Military production ramped up at rates that astounded Axis intelligence. Analysts. American factories did not merely produce tanks and aircraft, they produced the trucks to transport supplies, the ships to carry cargo across oceans, the construction equipment to build ports and depots, the communications gear to coordinate movements, everything required for a truly global logistics network. By 1943, American logistics were supporting operations simultaneously in North Africa, Italy, the Southwest Pacific, and the Central Pacific. Supplies moved from factories in the American heartland to combat zones 10,000 miles away with regularity that made it routine. An American soldier fighting on Guadalcanal in late 1942 could reasonably expect hot food, adequate ammunition, and regular mail delivery, despite being at the end of a supply line that crossed an entire ocean and passed through combat zones where Japanese submarines and aircraft hunted constantly. No Axis power could match this capability. Japan tried. Japanese logistics supported operations throughout the Pacific and Southeast Asia in 1942. But Japanese supply lines were brittle. American submarines devastated Japanese merchant shipping. Japanese industrial production could not replace losses. By 1943, Japanese garrisons on isolated islands were starving because supplies could not reach them. Japanese soldiers fought with courage and determination, but courage cannot substitute for food and ammunition that never arrive. Germany faced similar problems on a continental scale. German armies in Russia in 1943 and 1944 fought brilliantly at tactical and operational levels. German defensive operations during this period are still studied as examples of how to conduct mobile defense with inferior resources. But brilliance could not overcome the fact that German logistics could barely sustain defensive operations and absolutely could not support sustained offensives. The contrast was visible to German soldiers who encountered American logistics firsthand. When German forces captured the American supply depot at Kasserine Pass in Tunisia in February 1943, soldiers were astounded by what they found. Food in quantities they had not seen in years, real coffee, not ersatz substitutes, cigarettes, chocolate, all in such abundance it seemed wasteful. German intelligence officers examining the depot understood immediately what it represented. American logistics could deliver such abundance to North Africa, across an ocean, while simultaneously supporting operations in the Pacific and preparing for future campaigns in Europe. German prisoners of war held in the United States after 1943 experienced American abundance even more directly. Under Geneva Convention requirements, prisoners received the same rations as American soldiers. For many German prisoners, this meant eating better as captives than they had eaten as soldiers in their own army. Prisoners gained weight. They received medical and dental care superior to what had been available in German military hospitals. When asked after the war about their captivity, many German veterans remembered the food before anything else. This was not because Americans were more humane than Germans, though treatment of prisoners varied significantly between the two sides. This was because American logistics could feed prisoners adequately while still feeding its own military, its civilian population, and providing substantial aid to allied nations. The resources existed. The infrastructure existed to distribute those resources. Feeding an additional 400,000 German prisoners was well within American capacity. Germany, by contrast, could barely feed its own population by 1944. Official civilian rations in Germany provided 1,670 calories per day in winter 1944 to 45. Actual consumption was often lower as distribution networks broke down under Allied bombing. German civilians were malnourished. German soldiers were malnourished. German prisoners in German custody, particularly Soviet prisoners, starved by the millions. The calorie gap, as historians would later call it, was not merely about food, it was about everything: fuel, ammunition, spare parts, medical supplies, clothing. Every category of military logistics showed the same pattern: American abundance versus German scarcity, American flexibility versus German rigidity, American capacity to adapt and respond versus German inability to solve fundamental resource constraints. When Oberleutnant Brommann sat in his immobilized Panther tank 4 miles from the Meuse River in December 1944, he was experiencing the end result of strategic decisions made years earlier. Germany had chosen to build a military optimized for short, decisive wars of maneuver. America had chosen to build a military optimized for sustained industrial warfare. In 1939 and 1940, Germany's choice appeared brilliant. Blitzkrieg campaigns overwhelmed Poland, Norway, France. German panzers seemed invincible. By 1944, the fundamental flaw was undeniable. Wars of conquest produce occupations. Occupations must be sustained logistically. Germany had conquered vast territories, but lacked the logistics infrastructure to control them, while simultaneously fighting on multiple fronts against enemies with superior resources. The Wehrmacht, in late 1944, was an army that could still fight tactically, but could no longer maneuver strategically because the fuel did not exist to move in operationally significant ways. American forces in late 1944 faced no such constraints. When German forces attacked in the Ardennes, American logistics reoriented within 48 hours to support counteroffensives from multiple directions. Patton's Third Army moved 70 miles in winter conditions and arrived fully supplied. British forces attacked from the north, also fully supplied. American divisions that had been resting or refitting were rushed to the Ardennes and arrived with full combat loads of ammunition, fuel, and equipment. The speed and scale of American response demonstrated what industrialized logistics could achieve. Germany had committed its last reserves, achieved tactical surprise, penetrated 40 miles into Allied territory, and within 10 days, American logistics had assembled overwhelming force to contain and crush the penetration. Not because American soldiers fought better, though they fought well. Not because American equipment was superior, though it was adequate. Because American logistics could sustain combat power, the German logistics could not match. After the Ardennes offensive failed, Germany had no strategic reserves remaining. Every subsequent battle was defensive. German forces retreated across the Rhine in March 1945, not because they had been defeated in battle, but because they lacked fuel to maneuver and ammunition to sustain defense. When American and British forces crossed the Rhine and began the final advance into Germany, German resistance collapsed not from lack of will, but from lack of means. German soldiers in April 1945 wanted to fight. Many units had orders to fight to the last. But soldiers cannot fight without ammunition, and tanks cannot move without fuel. Artillery cannot fire without shells. By April 1945, German logistics had ceased functioning as a coherent system. Units fought with whatever they had until it was exhausted, then surrendered. Some fought on with small arms when heavy weapons ran dry. But the outcome was inevitable once the logistics collapsed. Brommann surrendered to American forces on April 18, 1945, near Magdeburg. His unit had been retreating for 3 months, fighting occasional rearguard actions, mostly just trying to stay ahead of advancing American forces. They ran out of fuel definitively on April 17th. The tanks were pushed into a defensive position by whatever vehicles still had fuel. Then those vehicles ran dry too. On April 18th, American tanks appeared. Brommann ordered his crew to destroy the Panther's gun and radio. Then they surrendered. Brommann spent 2 years in American custody, first in camps in Germany, then in a camp in France. He was well fed. He gained back weight he had lost during years of inadequate rations. He received medical treatment for injuries that had never properly healed. He was eventually released in 1947 and returned to Germany. He worked in civilian life, rarely spoke about the war, and died in 1993. In 1986, a German military historian interviewed Brommann for a project documenting veteran experiences. The historian asked what Brommann remembered most about the Ardennes offensive. Brommann's answer was immediate. The fuel gauge. Watching it drop, calculating how far he could go. Receiving orders to advance when the mathematics said it was impossible. Realizing that Germany had sent him into battle in a 45-ton tank without enough fuel to reach the objective. The historian asked if Brommann had been angry about this. Brommann said no. Anger was not what he felt. What he felt was a kind of clarity. The moment he understood that fuel was not coming, that the promised resupply was not going to materialize, that Germany simply did not have the resources to sustain the offensive, he understood the war was over. Not over in the sense that fighting would stop immediately, over in the sense that the outcome was determined. Germany could not win a war, it could not fuel. This realization was not unique to Brommann. Thousands of German soldiers in late 1944 and early 1945 had similar moments of clarity. Some came when they saw American supply convoys stretching to the horizon. Some came when they captured American positions and found stores of equipment that exceeded what entire German divisions possessed. Some came when they tried to retreat and discovered their vehicles had no fuel to move. The moment varied, but the realization was the same. America possessed resources Germany could not match. American logistics could sustain operations Germany could barely imagine. The gap was not closable through superior tactics or better training or greater determination. The gap was fundamental, industrial, unbridgeable. German soldiers after the war often spoke of American material superiority with a kind of resigned acceptance. They acknowledged that American soldiers were adequately trained and reasonably brave. They often claimed German soldiers were better at tactical level, but they universally acknowledged that American logistics were overwhelming. One German veteran, interviewed in the 1970s, put it simply. He said the Americans did not need to be better soldiers, they just needed to bring more supplies, and they always did. This was the lesson of World War II logistics. Quality matters, training matters, tactics and leadership matter, but sustained operations require logistics that can deliver fuel, ammunition, food, spare parts, medical supplies, everything a modern military needs, consistently, reliably, in quantities sufficient to maintain combat power. The side with superior logistics has an advantage that can overcome deficiencies in other areas. The side with inferior logistics faces constraints that negate advantages elsewhere. Germany in World War II had many advantages at various points: superior tank designs in some periods, better small unit tactics in many situations, officers with extensive combat experience. None of it compensated for logistics that could not fuel tanks, supply ammunition, or feed soldiers adequately across multiple fronts simultaneously. The United States had logistics that could do all those things. American logistics were not perfect, errors were made, supplies sometimes went to wrong locations, units occasionally ran short of specific items, but the system worked. It delivered what was needed, where it was needed, consistently enough to sustain operations across global distances for nearly 4 years. This capability did not emerge by accident. It was the result of deliberate choices made before the war began, choices to invest in transport infrastructure, choices to prioritize logistics in military planning, choices to build redundancy into supply systems, choices to treat logistics as a combat function, not an administrative afterthought. These choices created the logistical superiority that enabled victory. The Ardennes offensive was Germany's last attempt to change the war's trajectory through offensive action. It failed because German logistics could not support the operational plan. This failure was not surprising to anyone who understood the resource situation. It was perhaps surprising only in that German leadership chose to attempt an operation so obviously beyond available logistical support. But desperation drives decisions that rational analysis would reject. Germany in December 1944 was desperate. Soviet armies were advancing from the east, American and British armies were advancing from the west, German cities were being destroyed by bombing, German industry was collapsing, German logistics were failing. One bold stroke to split the Western Allies, capture a major port, gain time to deal with the Soviets. It was worth attempting even if the chances of success were slim. The offensive failed because modern warfare runs on fuel, and Germany did not have enough fuel. That simple fact determined the outcome more surely than any tactical decision or battlefield event. Tanks without fuel cannot advance. Armies without supplies cannot fight. Logistics decides wars. This was true in 1944. It remains true today. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.